My name is Madison Torres, and if you're listening to this, it means I just destroyed Stanford University's computer science department in front of the biggest tech conference in Silicon Valley. What those Ivy League professors didn't know when they kicked me out 3 years ago was that I'd been recording every meeting, every lecture, every time they stole student ideas and called them their own research. See, when you grow up in Modesto with a dad who fixes cars and a mom who cleans houses, you learn that the system isn't designed for people like you. But sometimes you can beat the system by becoming better at their own game than they ever imagined possible. This is my story. This is how a community college dropout built a billion-dollar company and used it to expose the biggest academic fraud scandal in Stanford's history. Let me start from the beginning. I'm 24 years old, born and raised in Modesto, California. Not the glamorous part of California you see in movies, the Central Valley part where it hits 110 degrees in summer and smells like cow manure most of the year. My dad, Roberto Torres, owns Torres Auto Repair. My mom, Elena, cleans offices and houses for rich families in the hills. They came here from Mexico when I was 2, with nothing but determination and the belief that America was the place where hard work actually mattered. Dad taught himself English by reading car manuals. Mom learned by watching soap operas while she cleaned. They both worked 16-hour days, so I could have opportunities they never had. I was always good with computers, not because we had the latest technology at home, we didn't, but because old Mrs. Henderson down the street let me fix her ancient desktop when I was 12, and I got hooked. I'd spend hours in the public library teaching myself programming languages from books that were probably older than I was. High school was complicated. I was valedictorian, captain of the coding club, winner of every computer science competition within 100 miles, but I was also the girl who spoke Spanish at home, who brought homemade tamales for lunch while other kids had their parents' credit cards for the campus cafeteria. My guidance counselor, Mr. Peterson, kept pushing me toward the local community college. He'd lean back in his chair and say, "Madison, you're very bright, but Stanford, that's a different league. Maybe start at Modesto JC. Transfer after 2 years?" He meant well, but I could see it in his eyes. Kids like me didn't go to places like Stanford. But I had something he didn't expect. Perfect SAT scores. A coding portfolio that made grown programmers cry. And an app I developed in high school that helped immigrant families navigate the healthcare system. It had 50,000 downloads in 6 months. My computer science teacher, Mrs. Chen, helped me submit it to state competitions where I won first place 3 years running. Stanford accepted me with a full ride. Need-based aid, merit scholarships, work-study programs. On paper, I was their diversity success story, perfect for their brochures and donor meetings. What they didn't mention in those brochures was how it would feel to show up on campus wearing Target clothes while your roommate unpacked designer luggage, or how professors would smile politely when you contributed to class discussions, then act surprised when your projects were consistently the best in the program. My freshman year was rough but manageable. I kept my head down, studied constantly, worked in the computer lab 20 hours a week to cover living expenses. Made a few friends, mostly other scholarship kids who understood the hustle. I thought if I just worked harder than everyone else, if I proved myself through pure merit, I'd eventually belong. Sophomore year, everything changed. That's when I met Dr. Harrison Blake III. Yes, the third professor of computer science Stanford legacy whose grandfather helped found the department. Old money, old connections, old ideas about who belonged in his field. Dr. Blake taught advanced algorithm design, the gateway course for the master's program, mandatory for anyone serious about a career in tech. He had this way of looking at students like he was evaluating livestock, deciding who was worth his time and who was just taking up space. The first day of class, he asked everyone to introduce themselves and share their background. When it was my turn, I said, "I'm Madison Torres from Modesto. My parents are immigrants, and I'm interested in applications that could help underserved communities." He nodded politely and moved on. But I caught the look he exchanged with his TA, Brandon Ashworth. Wharton undergrad, Silicon Valley connections, everything I wasn't. It was the kind of look that said, another diversity admit who'll wash out by Christmas. They were wrong. My first project was building an algorithm to optimize resource allocation for food banks. Not sexy by their standards, but it worked. 3 Northern California food banks started using it within a month, reduced waste by 37%, helped feed an additional 2,000 families weekly. Dr. Blake's response? He looked at my presentation with this condescending smile and said, "Interesting application, Madison. Though I'd encourage you to think more theoretically. Real computer science is about advancing the field, not social work." Social work, like helping people, was somehow beneath the dignity of computer science. My second project was even better. I designed a machine learning system that could predict equipment failures in manufacturing plants. Tested it on data from my dad's shop and 2 local factories. 94% accuracy rate, potential to save millions in downtime costs. This time, Dr. Blake was interested, very interested. He called me into his office, this intimidating space with dark wood paneling and degrees covering every wall, and said, "Madison, this is impressive work, really sophisticated analysis. I'd like to review your code and documentation more thoroughly, for academic review purposes, to help me give you proper feedback." I was naive enough to trust him. I handed over everything, my code, my research methodology, my testing data, everything I'd spent 4 months developing. 2 weeks later, Dr. Blake presented a paper at the International Conference on Machine Learning titled Predictive Maintenance Using Advanced Neural Networks. Same algorithm, same methodology, same results. His name as lead author, with a tiny footnote acknowledging student research assistants. I confronted him in his office, printouts of my original code in hand. My voice was shaking with anger as I said, "Dr. Blake, this is my work, my algorithm, my research, my innovation." He looked at me like I was a child having a tantrum. He didn't even seem embarrassed. He leaned back in his leather chair and said, "Madison, you developed this work in my class, using university resources, under my supervision. Academically, this is collaborative research. Your contribution is acknowledged in the paper." Acknowledged? You presented it as your breakthrough. I refined your work, placed it in proper theoretical context, made it publishable. That's what mentorship means in academia. You should be grateful for the learning experience. He wanted me to be grateful that he'd stolen my work and called it mentorship. But I was still naive enough to believe the system would protect me. I filed a formal complaint with the department, documented everything, requested a formal hearing. Surely with evidence this clear, justice would prevail. The hearing was a complete joke. 3 professors, all Blake's colleagues, all white men over 50 who'd known him for decades. They listened politely while I presented my case, nodded sympathetically like they actually cared, and concluded that while there might have been miscommunication about authorship, Dr. Blake had acted within normal academic mentorship guidelines. The department head, this ancient guy who looked like he'd been there since Stanford was founded, said to me with this patronizing tone, "In the future, we encourage clearer communication about collaborative work expectations." Blake didn't even get a reprimand, but I got a reputation as a troublemaker who didn't understand how academia worked. Junior year was when the real assault began. Suddenly, my project proposals were rejected for being not sufficiently rigorous. My code was critiqued for style choices that other students made without comment. Group projects became exercises in isolation. Somehow I was always the team member who got excluded from planning meetings. But the worst part was watching Blake continue to harvest student innovations like he was running some kind of intellectual property farm. Jessica Wong's cybersecurity algorithm became his next conference paper. Marcus Johnson's data visualization tool got presented at tech industry panels, always with that same footnote acknowledging student research assistants. That's when I started recording everything. Every office hours meeting, every class discussion, every interaction where students presented ideas that might mysteriously become Dr. Blake's research. I told myself I was just documenting for my own protection, but really, I was building a case. The breaking point came during my senior thesis project. I'd spent 2 years developing a platform that used AI to help small businesses optimize their online presence. Not theoretical research, a working system that was already helping 43 local businesses increase their revenue by an average of 32%. My thesis advisor? Dr. Blake, of course. The department required all computer science seniors to work with tenured faculty, and he specifically requested to oversee my project. He said with that cold smile of his, "Given our previous collaboration, I feel uniquely qualified to guide your work." For months, he met with me weekly, reviewed my progress, offered suggestions, always encouraging, always supportive. He'd look at my code and say things like, "This has real commercial potential, Madison. We should consider publishing this work, perhaps even pursuing patent protection." I thought maybe I'd misjudged him. Maybe he'd learned something from our previous conflict. Maybe this time would be different. I was so fucking naive. 2 weeks before my thesis defense, Stanford announced a new partnership with a major consulting firm to develop AI-powered business optimization tools. The lead researcher? Dr. Harrison Blake III, the technology being licensed, remarkably similar to my senior thesis project. But here's where Blake made his fatal mistake. He got greedy. Instead of just stealing my algorithm like he'd done with previous students, he decided to destroy my thesis entirely. He called me into his office the day before my defense with this grave expression on his face. "Madison," he said, looking like he was delivering tragic news, "I've discovered some concerning irregularities in your thesis work, code segments that appear to be plagiarized from existing open-source projects, documentation that doesn't match your claimed development timeline. I'm afraid I have no choice but to fail your thesis and report possible academic dishonesty." I sat there in shock as he showed me evidence of my supposed plagiarism. Code that looked similar to mine but was somehow time-stamped months earlier. Papers that allegedly proved my ideas weren't original. A case built so carefully that it would be almost impossible to refute. "Of course," he continued, his voice dripping with fake concern, "if you're willing to acknowledge these errors, perhaps we can work something out. A thesis revision, acknowledgement of your mistakes, a chance to graduate with your class." I understood the deal. Admit to plagiarism I didn't commit, let him keep my algorithm, graduate quietly, and never speak of this again. The alternative was academic destruction, public humiliation, and the end of any career in tech. I looked him in the eye and said, "Professor Blake, I need some time to consider this." "Of course, but Madison," he paused dramatically, "I'd encourage you to think carefully about your future. Accusations of academic dishonesty tend to follow students throughout their careers." That night, I made the hardest decision of my life. Instead of defending my thesis the next morning, I withdrew from Stanford. Officially, I was taking a leave of absence for personal reasons. Unofficially, everyone knew Madison Torres couldn't hack it at Stanford. My parents were devastated. 3 years of sacrifice, of believing their daughter was going to be the first college graduate in our family, of bragging to everyone at church about their Stanford girl. All for nothing. My dad tried to hide his disappointment, but I could see it in his eyes when he said, "Misha, education is important, but it's not everything. You can work with me at the shop, maybe take some classes at the community college." My mom just cried, quietly in the kitchen when she thought I couldn't see. All those years of cleaning rich people's houses, of saving every dollar for my education, of sacrificing so I could have opportunities she never had, and I'd thrown it all away. Except I hadn't thrown anything away. I just learned that sometimes you have to lose everything to understand what you're really capable of. I moved back to Modesto with my laptop, my code, and a fury that burned hotter than Central Valley summers. If the academic world didn't want me, fine. I'd build my own world. I spent the next 6 months living in my childhood bedroom, working 18-hour days on my platform. Not the version I developed for my thesis. Something bigger. Something that would make Blake's theft irrelevant because my new innovation would be so far beyond what he'd stolen. My dad let me use the back office of his auto shop as headquarters. The space smelled like motor oil and had terrible Wi-Fi, but it was mine. Mom brought me coffee and homemade sandwiches when I forgot to eat. They didn't understand what I was building, but they understood I was building something important. The platform I created wasn't just for small businesses anymore. It was for any organization that needed to optimize complex operations with limited resources. Restaurants figuring out staffing schedules, medical clinics managing patient flow, logistics companies routing deliveries. The applications were endless, but I needed beta testers, and I needed funding. That's where my Stanford connections actually helped. Not the professors, but the students I'd worked with. The other scholarship kids, the international students, the ones who'd also been dismissed by the establishment. Marcus Johnson, whose data visualization Blake had stolen, was working at a startup in San Jose. I called him up and said, "Marcus, remember that algorithm Dr. Blake presented as his research? I've got something that's going to make him look like he's still programming with punch cards." He laughed and said, "Madison Torres, I was wondering when you were going to show up and burn that place down." Marcus introduced me to his CEO, who became my first major client. Jessica Wong was at a cybersecurity firm that needed optimization tools. She brought in 3 more clients within a week. Within 8 months, I had 47 businesses using my platform. Within a year, that number was over 300. All word of mouth, all organic growth, all because the system actually worked. That's when Silicon Valley started paying attention. TechCrunch wrote an article about the Stanford dropout building AI solutions for Main Street America. Forbes included me in their 30 under 30 list. Venture capital firms started calling, offering funding rounds that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. But the call that changed everything came from an unexpected source. Dr. Richard Santos, the new dean of Stanford School of Engineering. Apparently, they were having some image problems. Questions about diversity, concerns about faculty conduct, pressure from donors who wanted to see more inclusive innovation. "Madison," he said during our phone call, his voice oozing fake warmth, "Stanford made a mistake. We'd like to invite you back to complete your degree, perhaps even consider you for our new entrepreneurship program." I listened politely while he outlined their offer. Full scholarship, research stipend, guaranteed thesis approval, fast track to graduation. Everything I'd wanted 3 years earlier. "That's very generous," I told him, keeping my voice neutral. "But I'm pretty busy with my company these days. We're in the middle of a Series A funding round." Of course. But Madison, you have to understand, a Stanford degree opens doors that nothing else can. No matter how successful your business becomes, you'll always be the dropout who couldn't finish. Is that really the legacy you want? That's when I knew exactly what my legacy would be. "Dean Santos, I appreciate the offer, but I think I'll pass. However, I would be interested in speaking at your computer science department. I have some thoughts about academic innovation that your faculty might find educational." 6 weeks later, I was standing on the stage at Stanford's annual Tech Innovation Summit, not as a struggling student begging for approval, but as the CEO of Torres Technologies, fresh off a $20 million funding round, invited as the keynote speaker on democratizing AI innovation. The auditorium was packed. Faculty, students, industry leaders, venture capitalists, and in the front row, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else on Earth, sat Dr. Harrison Blake III. I started with the expected content, my journey from Modesto to Stanford to Silicon Valley, the importance of inclusive innovation, how diversity of experience leads to breakthrough technologies. The crowd was engaged, applauding at appropriate moments. Then I shifted gears. But I want to talk about something else today. I want to talk about intellectual honesty in academia, about the difference between mentorship and theft, about what happens when institutions prioritize reputation over truth. The room got very quiet. I could see Blake shifting uncomfortably in his seat. 3 years ago, I was a Stanford student working on algorithm development under the supervision of a respected professor. I developed innovative solutions, conducted original research, created technologies with real-world applications, and then I watched as that professor presented my work as his own at international conferences. Dean Santos looked like he wanted to cut my microphone, but I was just getting started. When I tried to address this through official channels, I was told this was normal academic mentorship. When I persisted, I was accused of academic dishonesty and forced to withdraw. The message was clear: students like me don't challenge professors like him. The audience was dead silent now. You could feel the tension crackling through the auditorium. So I'd like to share some recordings from my time at Stanford, just to provide context for this important conversation about academic integrity. What followed was 27 minutes of audio that destroyed Harrison Blake's career and exposed a pattern of intellectual theft that went back over a decade. His voice, crystal clear, stealing student innovations, threatening academic retaliation, dismissing concerns about authorship. The first recording was from our algorithm meeting. Blake's voice saying, "I refined your work, placed it in proper theoretical context, made it publishable. You should be grateful for the learning experience." Then a recording of him talking to his TA about student projects. These diversity admits have some interesting ideas, but they lack the sophistication to develop them properly. It's really a service we're providing, elevating their work to publishable standards. But the most damaging recording was our final meeting, where he'd tried to force me to admit to plagiarism. His voice, cold and calculated, explaining exactly how he'd fabricated evidence to destroy my thesis. "Madison, I've built a very convincing case of academic dishonesty. Your code, your documentation, your research methodology, it's all going to look very suspicious to the review board. But if you're willing to acknowledge your mistakes, we can avoid this unpleasantness." The recording continued with Blake explaining how he'd done this before to other students who'd challenged him, how the system protected professors and discarded students who didn't know their place. The audio ended with Blake's voice saying, "Accusations of academic dishonesty tend to follow students throughout their careers, Madison. I'd hate to see that happen to such a promising young woman." When the recordings finished, the auditorium erupted, students cheering, faculty looking shell-shocked, Blake nowhere to be seen. He'd slipped out during the presentation like the coward he'd always been. But I wasn't finished. Dr. Blake presented my machine learning algorithm as his breakthrough research at 3 major conferences. That algorithm is now the foundation of Torres Technologies' core platform, which has helped over 1,500 businesses optimize their operations and generated $47 million in measurable economic impact. I clicked to my final slide, showing the patent documentation for my platform technology. The original code was developed in 2019 during my time at Stanford. The patents were filed in 2021 under my name with full documentation of the original development timeline. Dr. Blake's published papers, well, they're looking pretty derivative right now. The crowd was on their feet. Not just students, but faculty members, industry leaders, even some Stanford administrators who were probably calculating the legal and public relations nightmare they were facing. Dean Santos approached the podium as I finished, looking like a man who'd aged 10 years in 30 minutes. "Madison, on behalf of Stanford University, I want to apologize for the treatment you received. This institution failed you, and we're committed to ensuring nothing like this happens again." I looked out at the audience, at the faces of students who saw themselves in my story, at the professors who were probably wondering what recordings might exist of their own conduct. "Dean Santos, I appreciate that. But apologies aren't enough anymore. Stanford needs to implement real accountability measures for faculty conduct, independent oversight for intellectual property disputes, protection for students who report misconduct, and most importantly, you need to acknowledge that innovation doesn't only come from the people who look like your traditional idea of brilliance." The investigation that followed my presentation was swift and thorough. Blake was terminated within a week, his published papers retracted, his consulting contracts canceled. 2 other professors were suspended pending review. The department implemented new policies for student-faculty collaboration and intellectual property protection. But the real victory wasn't Blake's downfall. It was what happened next. 17 students came forward with their own stories of idea theft, academic bullying, and systematic discrimination. The scandal made national news, sparked congressional hearings about research integrity, and led to policy changes at universities across the country. Torres Technologies grew into exactly what I'd envisioned, a platform that democratizes business optimization for organizations that don't have access to expensive consulting firms. We now serve over 10,000 clients, employ 230 people, and have offices in 12 cities. Most importantly, 43% of our employees are first-generation college graduates. 27% are college dropouts or transfers who found success outside traditional academic paths. We actively recruit from community colleges, state schools, and coding boot camps, all the places where real innovation happens when people aren't worried about fitting into someone else's definition of success. Blake? Last I heard, he's teaching at a community college in Ohio. Nothing wrong with community colleges, of course. Just ironic that he ended up at the kind of institution he'd probably dismissed his entire career. 6 months ago, Stanford offered me an honorary doctorate. I declined, but I made a counteroffer. I'd fund a new scholarship program for first-generation computer science students with one condition. Recipients would have final authority over any intellectual property they developed during their studies. The Torres Foundation Scholarship now supports 50 students annually. Students who look like me, who come from places like Modesto, who understand that technology should serve communities, not just corporations. My name is Madison Torres. I'm the Stanford dropout who built a billion-dollar company and used it to reform academic research integrity. I'm the daughter of immigrants who proved that success isn't about where you start or what institutions validate you. It's about what you build when everyone tells you you're not good enough to build anything. And if you're listening to this from your own dorm room, your own childhood bedroom, your own place at the bottom of someone else's hierarchy, remember this: they can steal your work. They can question your qualifications. They can try to convince you that you don't belong in their world. But they can't steal your mind. They can't patent your determination. And they definitely can't stop you from building a better world than the one they're trying to protect. The system isn't designed for people like us, but sometimes we don't need their system. Sometimes we can build our own,